call, please.
Ms. Penner,
Present.
Mr. Kernan, Mr. Powers, Mr. Groudon,
Here.
Mr. Dean,
Here.
Ms. Perez, Ms. Brown, Mr. Urtola,
Here.
Judge Garrett,
Present.
Mr. Bejarano,
Here.
Mr. Budnick,
Here.
Mr. Steinhardt,
Here.
Ms. Tornor.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you. I would announce the presence of our general counsel, Aaron McGuire, and immediately turn to the chair's report. And most of what I'd like to discuss today is just the CPOC conference they had 2 weeks ago. And it was really about a decade of excellence. It surrounded the progress on juvenile realignment. It was really uplifting. I want to give kudos to Scott Budnick, who convened a panel of ex-offenders that participate in his fabulous organization. And I will tell you that brought down the house. It was super moving. You want to report a little bit on that, Scott? The individual that had been out for, I think, 3 weeks.
Oh, I mean, it was interesting. We had a panel. It was mostly young kids that have gotten out of probation camps and halls, but we had one ARC member on the panel that had started going into juvenile hall at age 11, was in foster care before that, then went into the adult system at age 18 and came out at age 60. And had spent 40 years incarcerated in the adult system, 37 of those years in the SHU, in solitary confinement. And he basically told all the probation chiefs how they could have stopped him when he was 11 years old by doing certain things that weren't done. And it was deep, it was fascinating, and with him were a bunch of young kids who went through the halls and the camps and DJJ and came out and are doing incredible things in the community and really did turn their lives around. So I think it told painted a pretty incredible picture of what works and what doesn't work.
Yeah, it was very powerful. And leave it to board member Budnick to manage to get that gentleman to meet the governor that evening. And he said, the one thing that the individual said to me was, so I'd really be proud if I could have a picture with the governor to send to my mother. So, Scott, early Christmas, delivered that evening. So it was really, really a great convening. While life is not perfect for this individual, he was informative and very, very humbled by being there. So it was a great day.
What about my opening video? Did you get a chance? I wasn't there and I didn't
Oh,
get a chance to see it.
I apologize. I saw your opening video.
David was there
I
on
actually-
the screen.
It was.
Apparently it was pretty forgettable.
Yeah, I don't even remember it.
I apologize. Actually, your remarks were excellent, and I did forget the video. I want to apologize in advance for that. And you were out of
It's
the country.
okay. I talked about realignment being 10 years old and that CPOC had done a great job. So there you go.
It was an uplifting conference. And I'll turn now to Katie for probably a more informed, substantial report from our executive director.
Wow, way to sell it. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the board. Katie Howard, your executive director, with a brief ED update for you, I promise. I really just want to tell you about so many of the important efforts that we have underway, committee work that's going on. I really do want to give a shout out to our State Advisory Committee on Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. It's been about a year since the governor made a whole slate of new appointments to that group. And Rachel Rios, who formerly was with DJJ, and for many years now has been the executive director at La Familia, is the new chair of the SACJAB committee. She's done a tremendous job this last year in bringing that committee together. I think it's now a very cohesive group. They're working on their next 3-year plan. To that end, we had a really terrific 2-day meeting here in the boardroom in the middle of October. One of the highlights of that was having a long and sort of a far-reaching conversation with Dan Seaman from the governor's office so that the committee could better understand how the governor wants to hear input from them on issues of interest. There was also a meeting for the first time in a while of the Reducing Racial and Ethnic Disparities Subcommittee of the SACJ, and that was just last week on Halloween. That group is also re-energized and interested in plugging into the plan for the upcoming grant cycle. A lot of details remain to be worked out, and I would also like to give a huge shout out to Kimberly Bouchard and Alex Jarasevich, whose staff work on this has just been terrific. Related also, because of Rachel Rios, I want to share that I attended a mortgage burning party at La Familia Counseling Center here in Sacramento last night. Those of you who've been around may recall that the bond funding that supported that community centers building way back in 1988 was for a period of time administered by the BSCC when it was known as CSA. So Rachel very graciously invited Linda and me to attend as state partners. And I was able to go last night, which I was grateful for. Chuck Supple, the current DJJ director, and I, and our organizations were recognized by La Familia as being state partners. It was a wonderful event. I'm sure Francine's familiar with La Familia and the amazing services that they provide. In other just quick updates, Linda and I both attended the Pew CSAC Results First conference in Santa Barbara a couple of weeks ago. There have been 4 counties working on this project for a number of years, 4 or 5 or so, and 3 have recently joined, one of which is Ventura. I think that work is really, really interesting and important and provides a fantastic model for locals to use in how they're figuring out what services they want to use and where they want to put their resources. In kind of a similar vein, I just wanted to let you know that we've been working actively with the Public Policy Institute of California and our state partners on data sharing agreements for the multi-county study. As you know, starting shortly after realignment was enacted, there was it started as an 11-county study. There are now 12 counties with some very extensive data collection that's been going on and some reports that are in the process and soon to be published. So stay tuned. There will be updates coming in more depth to this board, but that work is ongoing. I'd also like to thank Casey Wormuth, our new research manager. Is Casey in the room? She has been great in helping us to work through some of these issues. On the ESCs, I don't need to say much more than our JAG, Proud Parenting, and RSAT ESCs are in various stages. Because of the uncertainty about the JAG funding, we are not having a JAG ESC meeting as planned next week in November. We'll talk more about that in the closed session later today. The Proud Parenting Group, chaired by Chief Bertola, had a great meeting on November 2nd here. RSAT is coming up in early December. And the other really significant work that's continuing and is underway is the juvenile regs revision, the Title 15 regs, chaired by David Steinhardt and Michelle Brown, Chief Brown, as you know. David, any comment on that? Well, we have another committee meeting coming up just next week.
Nothing, we're going forward as planned. Have a wrap-up meeting next week. We're good.
Good, thank you, David. In your materials, under your info tab, you have the legislative report for the bills that are of interest to the BSCC. These reflect all of the final actions for this legislative session, the first year of a 2-year session. So some were signed, some were vetoed, some are still moving, some are in a state of possibly, coming back in another, for the second year of the session. Happy to answer any questions you may have about the ledge report. And that is my update. Are there any questions from the board?
No questions, just a comment, just on the Pew results first.
Yes.
Nevada counties also.
You are also one of the
The
new counties. I'm sorry, Chief, for not mentioning that. Thank you. Glad to have you in the mix. I'm Chair.
Yes, I now turn to council.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members. Just a brief legal update. We're actually have a closed session item on the agenda. We'll talk a little bit more about the litigation that's going on and the board's role in that in the closed session. For now, just in terms of updates on BIRDJAG itself, the federal government still has not released the fiscal year 2017 awards. They are sitting on those pending some resolution involving the litigation in the Chicago cases. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about that in closed session. The second legal issue I wanted to bring to your attention, we're actually going to address somewhat in our new Cal VIP grant. We had an issue that was presented to us, a new novel issue, dealing with what is the board's obligation when we are made aware that one of our subrecipients or subcontractor of one of our subrecipients of our grants is involved in fraud. In this case, we had which I don't want to get into too much details, but there was a grant recipient and a subcontractor who was federally debarred, which means that the federal government found that they engaged in such conduct that was so egregious that they would be ineligible for federal funding for a period of 3 years. And our prime grantee approached us and asked us, well, what do we do, and what is the board's obligation in terms of passing through additional funding to someone who was federally debarred? Our grant guide, as it stands now, is not specific. If it was purely federal funding, it's very clear that we would not be able to give that money to that subrecipient. When it involves state funds, it's a lot less clear. So what we have done and what we're going to be doing going forward with our grants is including language in the grants, which is very explicit, that states if someone is federally debarred or has been convicted of fraud related to grants, that they will no longer be eligible for state funds as well as federal funds. So I just wanted to flag that and bring that to your attention as we will, that is part of the Cal VIP grant as well. Any questions on that?
Thank you. You actually made that seem much simpler than it actually was as we muddled through it. You know, with the change in the way we're doing business and, you know, the partnership with many CBOs, we're having to flag some issues that we had not historically dealt with. So I appreciate all your hard work on that. Turning now to consent items. Unusual for this board, we have one consent item. Does anybody want to pull the board meeting minutes, or can we move forward on the consent agenda with approval?
Move approval. Second.
All in favor? Aye. Opposed?
Abstain.
One abstention. Any public comments on this item? Motion carries. We move on from the consent agenda and on to discussion items. Standard and Training Corrections Compliance Report, the annual update. Yvonne. Just for the record, we have our new audio visual equipment, so everybody in the room might be able to see this PowerPoint. I'm pretty excited. And Katie would like you to know it's temporary. We're getting the real deal eventually.
So thank you, and good morning, and thank you for this opportunity to share with you the activities that the SCC division has been engaged in within this past year. I don't get a lot of opportunity to talk about the great work that comes to the SCC division, so if I go on too long, I'm sure you guys will let me know. So agenda item G is an information item. It is SCC's annual report, and this presentation focuses on some of the program statistics from the year, as well as compliance findings for last fiscal year. And then I'll also give you a brief update on the project that I have shared with you guys in the past to revise SCC's selection and training standards. So I will start with some of the program statistics. You can also refer to those statistics on attachment 1 of your agenda item. So as many of you know, and for those who are newer to the board, the SCC program is responsible for setting standards for the selection and training of local corrections personnel working in sheriff's offices, probation departments, and police departments that run and operate a jail. In fiscal year 2016-2017, we had 161 of those agencies participating in the SCC program. We also had just over 275 private training providers who deliver training to those agencies. Those agencies employed nearly 34,000 staff in the classifications of adult corrections officer, juvenile corrections officer, probation officers, and their supervisors, managers, and administrators. Those agencies administered nearly 16,000 entry-level selection exams to fill vacancies over that year. Looking at the JCO row on this slide, you can see that there was a spike in the last 2 years in the number of JCO exams administered in those years. And we believe this was due in part to movement of JCOs into newly created and vacant probation officer positions. Probation officer positions are often filled by JCOs, which then creates a JCO vacancy and the need to test. So as you can see on this slide, that spike appears to have leveled out last year, and we're seeing the number of JCO exams sort of return to normal levels. And I know this is really small this year. So STC's minimum training standard required almost 1.6 million hours of core and annual training for those staff. But the actual number of training hours delivered and completed statewide is substantially higher than that because many agencies exceed the minimum training standard. So are there any questions about some of these program statistics before I move into the compliance findings? Right. So all agencies that participate in the SCC program must meet SCC's training standards. And these standards require that all employees complete a prescribed course of training within the first year of hire. We call that our core training. And a defined number of training hours every year thereafter, depending on the classification. And we refer to that as their annual training requirement. SCC conducts an on-site annual review of every agency's training records to ensure that those training standards are met. SCC reviews a random sample of training files and also includes any training file that an agency identified as part of its required reporting to us. So they have to tell us if they believe that they have a training or compliance issue. And those are included in our sample. To be found in compliance with SCC's training standards, all of an agency's employees must have completed the required STC training or must have met one of STC's criteria for exemption. And these exemption criteria have been approved by this board. That criteria includes circumstances such as a significant medical or other types of leave during the year, which made it difficult or impossible for them to complete training. And if an agency fails to train all of its employees and does not meet the criteria listed here for exception, then the agency is found to be out of compliance. For fiscal year 2016-2017, 157 of those 161 agencies were found to be in compliance with SCC's training standards. 4 agencies were found to be out of compliance. And you can see a list of those agencies on attachments 2 and 3 of your report. I'm really happy to report that this really is the highest rate of compliance that we've seen in the last 15 years. We usually average around 6. This really is quite a dip for us, and we're really happy to see that. Those agencies that have been found out of compliance have all completed a corrective action plan. The field reps and SCC will monitor that corrective action plan throughout the year to help ensure that the agencies do come into compliance in the current year, and we are confident that all of them will be able to do that. So in addition to our regular program activities and compliance review process, SCC has been very busy with revising the core training standards for the entry-level ACO, JCO, and PO classifications. This is the academy-like training that they must complete within their first year of hire. This revision is being conducted under the direction of an executive steering committee chaired by Chief Ortola, and I've had the opportunity to provide periodic updates on that project over the past year. We are continuing to make really good progress on those revisions. Staff is currently compiling the work and recommendations that came from numerous work groups, and we hope to bring that information forward to the ESC in spring of next year to form final recommendations. Those recommendations will then come to this board for approval, and I look forward to bringing those recommendations to you, I'm hoping sometime in the summer. So that concludes the SCC annual report. Can I answer any questions? Yes.
Just kind of curious, and maybe Michael or David can answer this, or you can. there's been a significant drop in the number of juveniles in facilities. Why would the number of tests still be, fairly consistent with what it was 3 years ago?
So the test is to fill vacancies. So as JCOs leave JCO positions and move into PO, which is where we see a lot of movement occurring, then they're just filling those vacancies. So what you see is the number of positions, whether they're filled or not filled. So that's why you're seeing sort of this stable level of JCO positions. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question.
Well, no, I understand that,
Okay.
but if there's been a big reduction in the juvenile population, why would the number still be
Oh,
the
I
same?
see. The
Well, I think
juvenile
we
positions
budgeted,
stay the
locally, we budgeted for a certain number, and I think if we were to eliminate positions, then we risk the potential of not having the staffing for Title 15 that we would need. Locally, though, I think every county that has a juvenile hall with the drops are looking at those issues. I know personally myself, I've dropped my numbers from 18 full-time to an informal number of 14 to deal with those kinds of drops, so I'm not backfilling. So there are some local strategies that are going on. But I think we always need, just in case we were to get a rush, an increase in population, we need to be ready to deal with it.
And additional comment, the population, the occupancy is down by 50% over the last, the facilities, halls, camps, and ranches are about 50% of greater capacity, but the facilities are still open. So some units have closed. So we're still playing catch up between the open facilities and the staffing and the bigger decline in the population in custody. So that's part of the story as well.
And I reckoning back to my days as the chief in Fresno, we operated at about a 12% vacancy rate. And so we actually had testing done, scheduled out for 2 years in an effort to try to catch up with that. I assume that there is some correction now because of the reduced population and census in the halls, but I think, as you know, Sheriff, we test a boatload of people and have maybe a 2 or 3% rate of actually hiring individuals out of a lot of testing that is done. And
So is that the entry level testing?
that's the entry level. So for JCOs coming in.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Any other remarks from the board? Questions? Anything from the audience?
Good morning, Brian Goldstein with the Center on Juvenile and Criminal Justice. We appreciate that this information is being made available, and we're very interested in learning more actually about the number of JCOs at the county level. We appreciate that there's a listing of participating staff by county, and they have the overall numbers by fiscal year, but can DSCC make available to the public the actual number of JCOs by county? Thank you.
I don't know that would be that difficult.
No, it's actually not. That is something that we can do. It's reported to us by county.
All right. Any further public comment? This is a no action item. I certainly appreciate all your hard work. I'm really happy to see that the compliance rate is high. And I know you're doing a lot of work going into the future on the regs. I was happy to be able to present to the Words to Deeds conference about some of the really important work you're doing on those regs and training that surrounds mental health issues and the kind of hard work you've done. If you want to expand just a little bit on that for the board, the survey that you did and roll out a little bit of that information, I think it's helpful to the board.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to do that. One of the projects, sort of a mini project that came out of our overall project to revise the training standards, and it really came through the job analysis process, was the need for more and better training as it relates to behavioral health. And that came through really loud and clear during the job analysis process when we were talking to staff and they were talking about the need to have more and better training in this area. And so we pulled together a specific work group of mental health experts and folks who are performing the jobs to talk about that and to talk about what are the training needs necessary for this group. And I did actually do a presentation before this board about the details of that. But ultimately, what came out of that work group was recommendations for a new behavioral health module that ranges, depending on the classification, somewhere between 27 and 29 hours of training related to all kinds of different types of aspects of behavioral health, including we had substance abuse in there, we had stigma and bias, we had sort of the emotional survival and the impacts of, you know, such a difficult job on those who are performing it. We had recognizing signs and symptoms, knowing your appropriate resources and referral processes, and really understanding the resources that you have available to you at the local level. So it was really incredible work group. The recommendations that came out of there also were that it's important that we standardize this training across the state. So how SCC develops its standards currently, given the variation in policies across the state, is that we set most of our training standards at an instructional objective level, saying this is sort of the outcome we want for the training. And then we allow the agencies and training providers to develop the content around that specific to their individual needs. What we heard from the work group is that this particular module of training really does need a standardized approach across the state. So it would really be helpful to have standardized curriculum and instructor qualifications so that this training can be delivered consistently across the state. So for the first time, STC is working on developing that actual curriculum. So it'll be an actual lesson plan that can be picked up and delivered by qualified instructors with everything that they need to ensure that all of the important points are being made and that all of the necessary training is being delivered to those who ultimately have to take that training and apply it effectively on the job. So we're really excited about that because it is the first time we've done something like that. We do believe that it's going to be really helpful to the field. Those we've talked to about that in the field are also very happy to have that sort of reference available to them, and we hope to roll that out with the new training standards. So you guys will be seeing that as well as those standards come forward to you.
Is there funding attached to that? Because that's a lot of money to
It's
probation
a lot of
agencies,
hours.
30 hours
A lot
a
of
week,
hours.
that's a lot of money.
right. It's going to be embedded in the core, so it's going to be part of that core curriculum. And right now, there will be a cost savings associated with it because right now, when we roll out a standard and say, here are the instructional objectives, and the agencies and training providers have to develop that curriculum, and there's a cost and time associated with that. We'll actually be providing that curriculum this time, so that will save those development costs. But yes, there's absolutely a cost to delivering it, but again, it'll be embedded in core.
So where is core funding at this point? This is nebulous as post-funding,
Yeah.
and so it doesn't really cover full reimbursement?
Well, it never has. It's never been intended to fully cover, all the costs of training across the agencies, but we did experience in the current year a $4 million reduction, which equates to about a 20% statewide reduction in training. SCC is really working hard to help mitigate the impacts of that. We know that that's a big cut at the same time that we are looking at revising and adding, some training requirements. So we're really paying careful attention to where we can make changes so that we can roll out new training as well, so that it's not always going to be just an ad. So we're really looking at that. Some of the other things we've done is focus where those training dollars go. So one of the changes that we made this year is really honing in on filled positions, because those are the positions that will have a training obligation. So that helped us be able to, in the current year, increase the amount of money per position. And then one of the other things that we're doing is looking at transfer academies. So as folks transfer across classifications, they won't have to complete new entry-level training standards that they may have already completed, especially if they're experienced officers. And that also goes toward our selection exam, so that they won't have to complete a new selection exam. And all of those will result in savings at the agency level, but you're right, it comes at a time also that we have a cut in the amount of funding available. But we're trying to help sort of mitigate it to the extent that we can.
Anything else from the board? I think we thank and excuse you.
All right, thank you.
Moving on to item C, CalVIP for the California Violence Mr. Senator, you're speaking really loud. Go ahead.
Before we take up this item, Madam Chair, Mr. Budnick is going to step out of the room. His agency may apply for funding, and we recognize that you would have a remote interest within the meaning of Government Code Section 1091 at this time.
1091.
Thank you. And you're excused also, by the way.
Thank you.
All right, good morning, Madam Chair and members of the board. I just lost the presenter. My name is Colleen Curtin. I'm a field rep with the Corrections Planning and Grant Programs Division. I'm here today to present agenda item C. This agenda item requests board approval to release request for proposals, or RFP, for the California Violence Intervention and Prevention Grant, as recommended by its Executive Steering Committee. The proposed RFP can be found in your binder under attachment C1, and a list of individuals that served on the Executive Steering Committee can be found in agenda item C2. The 2017 Budget Act appropriated $9.215 million for the California Violence Intervention and Prevention Grant, also known as CalVIP, to be administered by the VSCC. This grant replaces the California Gang Reduction, Intervention, and Prevention Grant, or CalGRIP, which you will remember the state had administered since about 2008. This new grant reflects some of the same provisions that were contained in CalGRIP, and I want to outline some of those first. The City of Los Angeles is still eligible to receive $1 million in a non-competitive grant, and the remaining $8.215 million must still be distributed through a competitive RFP process. The maximum funding is still set at $500,000. Applicants also must commit to a 100% match on this grant, which can be a cash, an in-kind match, or a combination of both. That's another requirement that remained. City applicants are still required to convene a coordinating and advisory council to prioritize the use of the funds and to collaborate with area jurisdictions with the goal of reducing violence in the city and adjacent areas. And finally, the VSCC must still award grants to at least 2 cities with populations of 200,000 or less. That was a list of the grant provisions that remain unchanged from CalGRIP. There are, however, some notable changes reflected in the statute for the new grant. These include, under CalGRIP, eligibility was only open to California cities, and eligibility has now been extended to include cities and community-based organizations. So CBOs can now apply directly for this grant. The term community-based organization is broadly defined in the statute. Eligible applicants do not have to be registered with 501c3 status, though there are certain criteria they have to meet, and those are outlined in the RFP. Under the old grant, CalGRIP, cities were required to pass through 20% of their funds to one or more CBOs. And under this new grant, cities will be required to pass through 50%. So that pass-through amount has been increased to 50% through the CBOs. The VSCC is now required to give preference to applicants in cities or regions that are disproportionately affected by violence. And the VSCC must give preference to applicants that propose to direct funds to programs that have been shown to be the most effective at reducing violence. Work on this grant began in September of 2016, so over a year ago, in anticipation of the next round of CalGRIP funding. Board member Michelle Brown was appointed as chair of the ESC and served as its chair all the way through. We met back in November of 2016, but work on the RFP was suspended when the grant did not appear in the January 2017 budget, so that's CalGRIP. In lieu of CalGRIP, the legislature appropriated funds for the CalVIP grant, and so we reconvened that executive steering committee this year, incorporating all of the statutory changes that I mentioned. I want to thank Chief Bejarano I lost a couple members in that year gap, and I want to thank him for helping me fill that law enforcement vacancy. So since the VSCC is required to give preference to applicants in cities or regions that have been disproportionately affected by violence, one of the first tasks of the ESC was to figure out how to define that disproportionality and how to operationalize the preference. To do this, the ESC considered crime data reported to the California Department of Justice by city law enforcement agencies for 2015 and 16. Crime rate was used as the measure. That is the number of reported crimes per 100,000 citizens rather than a raw crime count. And that was done in order to get a truer picture of disproportionality.
The ESC chose to focus on 3 crimes in establishing that disproportionality, 3 crimes that are classified as violent by the FBI's Uniform Crime Reporting Program. These crimes were chosen because they are uniformly reported across the state by all city law enforcement agencies. And so while the ESC did discuss crimes like drug sales and gun violence, those were put aside for these violent UCR reported crimes. The 3 violent crimes that were considered in the analysis were homicide, robbery, and aggravated assault. And so our research unit produced a ranked list of cities by homicide rate, robbery rate, aggravated assault rate. The ESC then decided that those cities that fell within the top 5% for homicide rate, robbery rate, and aggravated assault rate would be designated for preference points according to the schedule that you see on the slide here. Cities that appear in the top 5% for all 3 of those crime rates would be awarded 8 points, and that represents about 5% of the overall available points. Cities that appear in the top 5% for 2 of the 3 crime rates would be eligible for 5 points, equivalent to about 3% of the points. And cities that appear in the top 5% for 1 of the 3 crimes would receive 2 points, equivalent to 1% of the total available points. Because community-based organizations are also eligible to apply, the ESC decided that CBOs that provide services within those cities will also be eligible for those preference points. Before we look at the list of the cities that are eligible for preference points, it is important to note that the ESC members did not see the names of any of the cities as they were developing the criteria. This was done intentionally to ensure objectivity in the ESC's decision. The ESC therefore focused on what the criteria should be rather than which cities would be impacted and receive the points. Using the criteria set by the ESC, 101 cities out of 457 will be eligible for preference points, with 10 cities in the first tier, 26 cities in the middle tier, and 65 cities in the bottom tier. The list of cities eligible for preference points can be seen on these next 3 slides and on page 19 of the RFP, which is attachment C1. Here are the cities in tier 1. These cities, again, appear in the top 5% for all 3 crime rates, homicide, robbery, and aggravated assault. Here are the cities in tier 2. These cities, again, appear in the top 5% of crime rates for 2 of the 3 violent crimes. And here are the cities for tier 3. That's going to be very difficult to read. These cities appeared in the top 5% for 1 of the 3 violent crimes. And I want to take just a minute here to note that there were some concerns expressed by the ESC once they saw the list of cities that would be eligible for points. You might note that there are a few very small cities on the list, including a couple cities with populations of less than 1,000. And some worried that these outliers may have skewed the results and prevented some other worthy cities from getting into the preference points. But this is not the case. Our research staff recognize those outliers, identify those outliers. They were taken out of the analysis and then just put back in for purposes of receiving points. We spent a lot of time looking at this issue, though, in light of those concerns. And in the end, after discussing with Chief Brown and our research team, staff is recommending that the preference points system remain as the committee had initially recommended. I want to remind the members that no city, though, will be given more than a 5% bump as a result of those preference points. Applicants will still be scored in these 4 areas: project need, project description, project evaluation, and budget. Applicants will still have to make a strong case for why they need these grant funds, and the needs section is weighted heavily at 35%. Similarly, applicants will have to make a strong case for why they selected a particular program or strategy, and applicants will be scored according to how well they demonstrate that program or strategy is proven effective. I'm almost done. Moving on to funding distribution. The ESC also considered whether and how the funds should be distributed among those 2 eligible applicants, cities and CBOs. They ultimately decided to split the funding in half, with roughly $4 million available for cities and $4 million available to CBOs. And then there's that $1 million still available for the city of Los Angeles. All applicants will be allowed to apply for any amount up to and including the $500,000, which is the maximum amount allowed by statute. This grant will be a 2-year grant starting on May 1, 2018, ending on April 30th of 2020. This time frame allows for the maximum amount of time in the field. Once the RFP is released, prospective applicants will have 10 weeks to complete their proposals with a due date of January 22nd, 2018. Because the grant is now open to CBOs, we anticipate that there will be a greater interest and demand for this grant. And to address that interest, we will be holding 2 bidders conferences, one here in Sacramento and one in Southern California in early December. Proposals will be scored in February and March, with funding recommendations coming to you at your April board meeting. So this concludes my report. I would just like to thank the members of the Cal VIP Executive Steering Committee, one of which is here today, Ray Lozada from the Sacramento County Probation Department. I'd like to thank Chief Brown, who stuck with us through the 1.5-year long process. And I will close by recommending that the board approve the release of the Cal VIP RFP. Are there any questions about the grant?
Well, I think yes, you did a great job with this, and down to the detailed analysis on the reference points. And I'm glad to see that the $9.25 million has survived over so many legislative cycles. So that's certainly good news. I had a question regarding how the proposal is developed at the local level, because I saw reference to the Juvenile Justice Coordinating Councils. Could you explain a little more? Is there a local collaborative that has to be developed to launch the proposal in the first place?
City applicants are required to put together or to convene an advisory and coordinating an advisory council. And that requirement has been in the statute since the beginning of CalGRIP. That council can be an existing committee or council at the local level, and their job is to prioritize the use of the funds at the front end. Once a city is awarded funds, they have a requirement to collaborate with area jurisdictions and agencies, including the Juvenile Justice Coordinating Council. And as for this grant, city applicants will be signing an assurance that they will, in fact, commit to that collaboration. And that's something that we would then, follow up on during our monitoring process.
So that means that CBOs applying independently could just kind of come at it on their own, I guess.
Yes, that's correct.
Anything else from the board? Anything from the audience, public comment? Questions? Back to the board. We're looking for a motion to approve the release of the CalDIP RFP.
Move approval. Second.
All in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. Let the record reflect that Mr. Budnick is still not in the room.
But we should probably go get it.
Yes.
Not necessarily.
Who's in charge of Mr. Budnick? There we go.
Not my turn, not my turn.
Yes. Item D, I see Allison has already made her way to the podium. Title 15, the visiting amendments.
Should I wait for Mr. Budnick?
We should. You got up too fast.
I'm
That's all.
sorry.
There he is. He wasn't too far. While we have this short pause, I am remiss in not asking people to fill out speakers cards if they wish to address in public comment. We haven't had to do that today because we haven't had very weighty issues, but on this issue, we may have a number of comments. If so, please fill out. I apologize for being gone for diminishing Okay, I think we're all present.
Good morning, Madam Chair and board members. I'm Allison Ganter, Deputy Director for the Facility Standards and Operations Division. And I'm here to present you with the final revisions to the visitation regulations and also to ask for your approval to submit the final rulemaking materials to the Office of Administrative Law. And so this is the final step for us in the rulemaking process. The rest of the process will be handled by the Office of Administrative Law. So what you have before you in attachment 1 is the final proposed revisions to the visitation regulations, which incorporate elements from the recently enacted AB 103. And this language, as you'll recall, was approved by the board at the September meeting and went through an additional 15-day public comment period in accordance with the Administrative Procedures Act. And while we received several public comments during that 15-day comment period, and those are contained in attachment 2, we did not make any revisions to the language that you approved in September. So what you're looking at is exactly what you saw at the September board meeting. So we have responded to each of those public comments in a document called the Final Statement of Reasons, and you have that in your attachment 3. And this document is required by the Office of Administrative Law as part of the rulemaking package. We are required to thoughtfully respond to each submitted comment on the proposed regulations in this document, which becomes part of the rulemaking record. And several of those comments were actually directed at issues beyond the scope of the proposed language. And while required responses are limited to the language that's being proposed, we did respond to those comments in that document as well. So upon your approval, we'll submit the final rulemaking package to the Office of Administrative Law for their review and approval. And we do anticipate an effective date of April 1st, 2018. I do want to acknowledge and thank Ginger Wolf, who carried the workload on this regulations package, on many of our regulations package, and she did a fantastic job with this. So I wanted to acknowledge her. And I am happy to take any questions.
Any questions or comments from the board? Inviting public comment. Sorry.
I have a question. I asked my fellow board members to indulge me. I've missed a couple of meetings where some of these topics may have already been discussed, and I just want to make sure that I'm educated before my vote. I understand that recently the governor had expressed disagreement with the timing of the date that we were going to use for the cutoff in terms of when we were grandfathering in various jails. Can you describe what happened at the state level in terms of gubernatorial comment regarding what we had proposed versus what we have now?
Yeah, I'd be happy to respond. Do you want to? I'll just start and then you can add your thoughts. Only to clarify, Judge Garrett, the change in the date for grandfathering prior to, it was moved from the date upon which the board first acted in February. That was the board's initial action with respect to the start date, after which there could not be any further changes to video only. It wasn't a governor's decision to back that date up to January 1st. It came through a legislative and governor negotiation in the budget process. It was more initiated by the legislature than the governor. The governor agreed to move that date back to January 1st. And
what was the reasoning? What was the thought process that went into that?
There, I'll turn
For the discussion.
Sure. Well, let me start with, is this getting picked up?
Is it getting picked up, Sean?
No, use the
Use the mic.
Sure. Well, let me start off with the decision of why we chose the February date for our purposes when we first started the reg making process, which was there was quite a bit of concern, certainly on my part, and I believe on Chair Penner's part, that we would be retroactively not punishing, I should say, but regulating or having a standard for which we would expect compliance without having properly notified anyone. So we felt there would be legal problems if we backed up the date prior to when the board actually started the reg making process. So that's the reason we chose the date of the board meeting itself to begin the regulatory process. The legislature has quite a bit more latitude in deciding what dates to choose, and they decided to back that up. And I believe it's backed up to that particular date because within the window between January 1st and the board meeting date, we did have a county that indicated that they were going to move to video only, or had moved to video only in January. And that was seen as, I'm searching for the evasive, problematic. And so the legislature, and again, through the negotiation with the governor, wanted to ensure that that particular county would remain as a in-person visitation facility, which
county?
Tulare.
Good to know.
And I do believe prior to even the action by the legislature and the governor on AB 103, the county had seen the light prior to that and had already chosen to move back to in-person visitation.
Just as information that Merced recently put in a scope to do in person too. So some counties have acted,
Yeah, but we have seen some activity that counties have changed and have done some scope changes to go to in person as well.
I had another question. I had received, the attachment, D3, just before the meeting started. It was emailed, but I didn't have a chance to copy it, so I've had a chance to go through it, superficially. I also am looking at a letter dated October 12, 2017, that has a lot of signatories that's addressed to Ginger Wolf, expressing concern, about, grandfathering and excluding counties based on a standard called submission of initial architectural planning. And so there seems to be some ambiguity about the specific definition of that term. Is that term defined in any of the legislation, regulatory documents that we have?
So we do have existing regulations with respect to Title 24 that speaks to two things. One is initial architectural planning, and one is referred to as initial planning. And I do think there is some slight ambiguity in those terms, although they really can only be read, in my opinion, in one cohesive way, which is the start of a jail construction project, whether it's funded by lease revenue bonds or whether it's being funded locally, wholly locally. There is a point in time in which the county effectively, and I'm going to use this analogy with respect to sort of just private building, which is effectively pulling permits. It's the point in time in which the architect and the design team knows what standards they're going to draw their architectural plans to, because you have to know what size the cells are going to be before you start making the architectural drawings. So at the point of time that occurs where you're basically and effectively locked into what regulations apply to you is at the initial architectural planning stage. And what that has meant for the board for many years is when a local county submits to us a letter of intent to build. At that point, they have already determined that they have a need. They've done some preliminary assessments as to what type of facility they're going to need. They usually provide us with proposed bed count, proposed footprint. We're going to build it at this location. We've considered that to be initial architectural planning. We have also considered that to be initial architectural planning when counties have applied for the lease revenue bond funding through the competitive bid process, through the RFP process. So when counties have submitted the RFPs to us, that has triggered that initial stage, initial architectural planning, and that is what regulations that they built to, which is part of Title 24. And Title 24 basically says that you're effectively, once you begin that process, you're grandfathered into those regulations because, again, for purposes of building efficiency, we can't, what the Building Standards Commission has generally held is you can't change building standards after some point of time in which construction has begun.
I am not that familiar with architectural processes. And what you seem to be saying is that we're going more by the custom that the board has followed as opposed to some kind of mandate. There's no statutory mandate, no administrative code mandate that's requiring us to adopt this. This is simply the way we've always done it. Is that correct?
No, Your Honor, I apologize for that. No,
Okay.
the code, there is a statutory code that doesn't specifically address local jails, but it does address construction in general, which speaks to sort of pulling of permits. And then we have Title 24 regulation, which talks about the grandfathering in of particular regulations. And that occurs at the initial planning stage. And that initial planning stage is described as when we receive a letter of intent to build. There is one word missing between initial planning and initial architectural planning, and that is the word architectural. The board has chosen to read, and I believe it is the correct legal reading, that those two things mean the same. Initial planning, letter of intent, and initial architectural planning are the same thing.
Just for my own edification, given I love statutes and that sort of thing, what are the code sections that we're talking about that set forth the definition? Do you happen to know?
The Title 24 regulation.
So the penal code is section 6029, and the Title 24 regulation is Title 24, Part 1, Section 13102C. And that speaks to the initial planning and the letter of intent. that's
And
required.
the penal code section 6029, do you know what that says?
That's the one that requires the Board of State Community Corrections to do a plan review of all construction of local detention facilities.
That in terms of the issue regarding initial architectural planning, that's not expressly addressed in that statute.
I don't believe so, but I'm not 100% sure.
Okay.
It's certainly directly addressed in that Title 24 section.
And the Title 24, Section 1301(2), parentheses C, do you know what that says?
I do. And this is also on page 12 in the final statement of reasons. There's an excerpt of that. It says, a city, city and county, or any combination thereof, which has an intent to build or remodel any local detention facility shall immediately file a letter of intent with the board. And the title of that section is initial planning, in which Aaron mentioned, we interpret as initial architectural planning. There's oh, I'm sorry, it's in page 12 in attachment 3.
Is that in the paragraph, the
It's in the
second
last
paragraph from
paragraph.
the end of that?
It's the last paragraph on that page, right above the footnote. And there are some other regulations that speak to exclusions and grandfathering in Title 24 as well. But they're not referenced here because it's not relative to the comments posed here.
All right, and so we are bound in the process of approving grants to facilities that don't have in-person visitation to use this language in terms of grandfathering in or not grandfathering in those jails. And you have to excuse the ambiguity of my question.
Yeah.
Are we bound by this? Because there's obviously a great concern about having in-person visitation, and if someone has submitted a letter of intent,
Right. So the best I can describe, and I hope this answers the question, is that the effect of our regulation, also the recent legislation and some soon-to-be effective changes in Title 24 is that no facility can be built without in-person visitation from here on out. And that includes any of the lease revenue bond funded projects that haven't yet been funded, that could be funded by a relinquishment, or any non-funded project. They will have to follow the most recent version of Title 24 that's now been changed to require that in-person space is built. And then in Title 15 that they actually have to provide in-person visitation moving forward.
and so if a county has submitted a letter of intent, but they haven't actually started construction and could in fact change their plans if they were required to do so, that county could still be grandfathered in and not required to provide in-person visitation, is that correct?
Correct.
I see Aaron grabbing for the.
There's a reason for that, which I think counts.
Yes, you're correct with the caveat of, for those projects, so we still have a list of counties that have the potential to continue to receive funding. If one of those counties receives the funding now, even though they've submitted a letter of intent to build already, they are required to get a scope change and are required to build in-person visitation. For those
Would you
that,
say that one more time, because that's really important, I want to make sure I understand that.
so counties that have not received a conditional award as of today, well, as of AB 103. If they get a conditional award in the future from this board through a relinquishment, well, and actually any new funding going forward, they are required to build in-person visitation space, even if they weren't planning to do so. So they have to, this board, in order for them to move forward, this board must and shall require a scope change, and they will be required to build in-person visitation and provide in-person visitation if they want to accept that conditional award.
If a county has submitted a letter of intent to the board, and they have not received any funding as of yet, they are grandfathered in by virtue of the fact that they submitted a letter.
No,
Just the opposite.
just,
What's the state of affairs?
So there's we have sort of two pipelines right now. There are projects that are in progress right now. They've already received their conditional funding. They are in some stage of build right now, so they've already been established by the State Public Works Board. They might have submitted design drawings to us or working drawings. They're in some part of the pipeline and moving their project forward. They were previously awarded funding many months ago, perhaps many years ago. If they had submitted a letter of intent, if their plans were video visitation only, they are allowed to continue to move forward because they have already been established, they're already been funded. There's also a group of counties and a group of potential counties that have yet to be funded. They have not been conditionally awarded, but they have submitted a letter of intent to build to us when they participated in the lease revenue, the competitive bid process. They were not successful in the competitive bid process, but they could still receive funding because that's what we do. Even if you didn't successfully win, you're still eligible to receive funding if a county ahead of you relinquishes that funding. If we're talking about one of those counties that has yet to be funded, if there's a county that relinquishes and we offer that money to that next county, they cannot, even if they were planning to build video visitation only, they cannot build video visitation only. They must request, and this board must grant a scope change to require in-person visitation for that project.
So we have been over a lot of these issues in the meetings that you were there for, and it's very convoluted and complex, and I totally get that. I think the zone of debate here at the board has been about the point in time at which counties that are already funded for jails can be grandfathered in. So there are about 12 facilities that were approved for funding in previous cycles. And because of this standard, they're going to be grandfathered in. Now, that has created a little bit of disagreement on this board, and some of us have not been in support of that policy and thought that the grandfathering provisions went too far. And you have a lot of the advocate letters and the points they make are around this interpretation that simply submitting a proposal cements your grandfathering in, because it would be within the discretion of the board to pick a different point of time or to require those counties to change their proposals at a later date. But a lot of water's under the bridge now. And also the legislature has more or less affirmed this statute through AB 103. So we're kind of down the road on this argument about the point in time and letter of intent that marks your which side of the grandfather you fall on. I don't know if that helps. I don't know how much farther we can go with it now. There's certainly been strong voting support on this board for this standard as it is now. I don't agree with it, and I want to make a comment after public comment and before the vote if I can. But I'm sort of trying to explain where the debate has been on this board, where the discretion of this board lies in terms of grandfathering, and how it's come out so far.
Thank you.
I think I asked this last time, but I can't remember if I actually got an answer. So my biggest concern or question was not necessarily about the date, but the term itself, grandfathering in. And if there are counties that receive that grandfathering as they move forward, is that just for that particular plan for that one expansion, not the whole county itself? So as they move forward to build other facilities in the future, they then fall under the new rules.
It's by facility.
Correct, that's correct. And it is complicated, and I think the legislature has affirmed where we're heading, and I think, as you indicated in your report to the board, the rationale for our response to the public comment on this had to do with, that kind of confirmation from the legislature. So I'm going to hopefully succinctly state it there and ask the board if there's any further comment on this.
So what happens if the board didn't approve this? What's the reality of what would happen?
Well,
There'd be no regulation and it would Trying to go back to the way it was before?
The regulation would stay as it is, which requires that each local detention facility provide visiting for its population. And then you would still be beholden as the administrator of that facility to the requirements in AB 103. So that you would have to provide in-person visitation if you weren't doing so prior to January 1st, 2017. So it kind of takes care of the.
This just, the regulation will now conform with 103. And that's really where we're at today. Probably not officially stated, but this is cleanup behind 103. So our regulations are in conform. So it's, I think it's an important finishing obligation of this board, rather than leaving it out of regs. Anything further? Anything from the public at this time?
Brian Goldstein from CJCJ filled out a card.
Good morning, Brian Goldstein with the Center on Juvenile and Criminal Justice. Before we start, I think it's important to remind everybody that we're not just talking about the regulations for local adult facilities. We're talking about the 75,000 people in California who are incarcerated in our county jails and their access to visitation. We know the importance of visitation for maintaining relationships with loved ones, with their community, and the importance of building out reentry and support. We, as was mentioned and as was stated in our public comment letter, have serious concerns about how the submission of initial architectural planning is being satisfied by merely submitting a letter of intent by the county. We don't think that that standard is reasonable. We think it contradicts the legislation AB 103, which requires that any county that has submitted a proposal to build a jail with no in-person visitation space has to submit a scope change to include in-person visitation. We also would ask that the board give consideration to language which says that that an incarcerated person would have to request in-person visitation. So we have concern around 1062D. We think that this would suggest that video visitation could be used to fulfill the requirements of this section if an incarcerated person does not request in-person visitation. We don't think that that standard should apply. And finally, we just want to reiterate the concern that was raised in the letter around the use of the term video visit and video visitation. We think it's inaccurate. The fact is, these are not visits, these are calls. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything further from the board? Any other public comment on this item? Mr. Steinhardt.
Is there any discussion around that item on that the person in custody must request in-person visitation? How do they know that they have that right? I mean, I haven't thought about this before, and I didn't intend to bring it up, but I think it's an interesting point, and I just wonder if it resonates with any other board members.
It resonates with me. I have the same concern.
And of course, I share those concerns.
I mean, it's so late.
Restate your concern, because I'm not sure.
Well, the standard would require the inmate to request in-person visitation under certain circumstances. So it's not an upfront right, it's one that's granted upon request, and I can't remember all the circumstances where that applies. And my concern is not so much with that as with, is there a methodology for making persons in custody aware that they have that choice? And can that be added? I mean, adding it to the regulation at this point throws a, what do they say, a wrench into the works in terms of timing. But I think it is a concern, and I'm just raising it, that's all.
Allison, I
And maybe
think
it can be handled in terms of process, education process or something.
I don't think it is an omission, I think actually it is addressed. So in another regulation, honestly.
Well, and in that new language, it does say that video visitation may be used to supplement in-person visitation programs. And there are a subsection of local detention facilities that will provide both and have been providing both in-person and video visitation. So this clarifies that the inmates do have that right to in-person visitation. And it'll be clearly stated in the facilities policies and procedures manual and also in orientation material. So inmates will be made aware of, it's posted in housing units, it's posted in lobbies. And also part of the legislation requires us as the BSCC to now affirmatively monitor in our inspections the methods and availability of visitation in local detention facilities, which again is something that's established at the local level by each individual administrator, and it's again allowing agencies to supplement their in-person with video visitation if they happen to be providing both.
So you said that as a matter of practice, the facilities post this information in various locations throughout the
That
facility?
is correct, and it's also provided, the agencies have different ways of providing orientation material, but generally they get a handbook, and outlined in there are their visiting hours. It's generally posted up in the housing unit, so the inmates are aware, and it's also generally posted in the public lobbies, so visitors, and now with technology on sheriff's department's websites. So it's
we
pretty
inspect
readily.
towards this.
Correct. We are
That's
now
important
going to be
also.
inspecting for the method or methods that each agency is providing in terms of visitation. The hours, so if it's Monday through Friday, 10 a.m. to 2 p.m., this is when this visitation is offered. And also the amount of time that each inmate is given for visitation. So we'll be able to monitor that in our inspections moving forward.
So for clarification, it'll be a mandate for the jails to supply that information to inmates.
It's not mandated in regulation. Well, it is in the orientation manual, but I've never been into a detention facility where it's not readily available, or have gone to a website where you couldn't figure out when and where and how you can visit your loved one in a facility.
Does the regulation say now that an inmate has to ask for in-person?
No, it simply says that
It
if
seemed to
you
be
do
the
offer
impression
both,
here, and I don't
right,
believe that's the case.
It's not.
I think that's the default.
correct.
You will get in-person visitation. You may have an option, if you're okay with another aspect or additional visits, to supplement that.
Is that correct? Will every inmate be given in-person visiting unless they ask for video visiting?
I think you can take it a step back, and each inmate will be given the option to choose either. I mean, some are going to choose in-person, some are going to choose video because it might be easier for them and their families.
So I personally believe it's immoral and unethical to build a facility without video visiting and without in-person visiting in the first place. And a bit disingenuous to say, oh, we're building a facility because we want more program space, since those are the buzzwords, but we're not going to build a visiting room. So just at its beginning, I think those who chose to go this route are a bit disingenuous about their motives. I think we have education programs, incredible education programs in the jails in Los Angeles that Sheriff McDonald runs, and every inmate coming in is supposed to be asked if they want to be in the education programs. And when you ask all the inmates, 90% of them said they're never asked that. So, and maybe they are, maybe they're not, maybe the experience is so tough of going and processing in that they just don't remember whatever it may be. Unless it's clear that you will get in-person visiting, unless you request otherwise, that to me feels like there's not clear.
And just on this point, assuming that the board is prepared to approve the regulation standard as it's drafted now, is there any reason why it could not be a policy of BSCC in terms of its inspection function and so on, to somehow articulate that that the best practice is to inform inmates of their rights under the standard. And that could be done collaterally without, stopping the train on this regulation. It's not part of this motion, but I just think it's a concern that lasts after this is done today.
Well, I'm gonna back up just a bit on this because certainly your concerns, Mr. Budnick, and yours, Mr. Steinhardt, were heard. And the legislature responded in a fashion that moved this agenda forward, that prohibited any further building without in-person visitation. And there were a number of complications and issues if we were to take that pocket of projects that were ongoing that neither the governor's office or the legislature could address. And so we moved on and moved forward in a way I think that is meaningful, that shows what we all believe to be the importance of in-person visitation, but we were unable to address retroactively based on counties that were doing it with video only. And so to revisit that at this juncture, I think we would cycle and come right back to where we are now, because it has been heavily debated and heavily considered, and even the legislature with their abilities could not come up with a solution that didn't allow for some of this. So I'm going to urge the board to adopt this recommendation so that we now comport with 103 and we move forward. In terms of best practices, we continue to do that in other venues, in other ways, in other fashions, and I'm not sure we're going to inspect towards that.
Can we just
Okay,
make?
well, I have a final statement.
Can we hear from Allison really quick?
So
and then
just
you?
one more clarification, if you look at the proposed regulation in D1 on page 1, and if you go up to the top of the regulation, again, just for clarification, remembering that each agency needs to develop policies and procedures in accordance with regulation, it does require, first and foremost, that the administrator is developing policies and procedures that requires as many in-person visits as the facility schedule, space, and staffing allow. So I think that's really captures the intent.
I'm sorry, where is that, Melissa?
I'm sorry, in attachment D1, if you look at Title 15, Section 1062, visiting, the regulation on the second half of that page, so D1, page 1.
Under subdivision A.
Correct, thank you, yeah, it's in the first paragraph under subdivision A. And attachment D, go one more, there it is. My eyes work well. So it does clarify that policies and procedures, the default is to require as many in-person visits as possible. And just in, when we talk about best practice or intent, I mean, right there, it captures the intent of this
It's
regulation.
taken care of right there in that sentence right there.
I'm done with that part, but I have another comment.
Okay. And I'm happy you're done, but I'd like to make sure everybody else on the board is done with that portion. It has the clarity that we needed. I defaulted to Allison first. I didn't do a great job. But I knew we addressed it in a different.
And just as a final factual point, how many jail facilities, how many counties are we talking about that fall into this twilight zone area? That's the subject of debate. What's the population of counties in there?
I'm sorry, what do you mean by the twilight?
The area, the grandfather in
That are
ones
grandfathered
that
in?
have submitted the letter of intent or have gone further that will not be required to have in-person jail visits.
15, yeah, 15. Yeah, and that
15 facilities.
correct. And it's important to note that that number will remain finite. There's going to be no changes, to added to that list. If any, as we talked about, some agencies are taking it upon themselves to do a scope change and go in person, but that list is finite.
Mr. Steiner, I think we're ready for your comment.
All right, and I've actually written this out, so I just gotta say this. So I've already made clear my own disagreement with the grandfathering provisions of the standard that allow video-only visitation in certain VSCC-funded jails. I think that the grandfathering provision in the standard goes too far for many of the reasons expressed by the advocates, and that it was within the discretion of the board to alter the timeline for qualifying for grandfathering, but that, of course, was not followed. However, I recognize that we've been over this territory 2 or 3 times, and it's been debated at the board level quite closely, and that the legislature has considered the timeline and the grandfathering provisions and come to a conclusion and drawn a line in AB 103. And also that the forward motion of this board in terms of votes is in favor of the standard as now written. The good news going forward is that video only will not happen in newly funded facilities or in those that get a conditional award subject to the scope change. So I would just like the minutes to reflect that I disagree with the grandfathering policy that's in the standard as it's now written, and that I plan to abstain from the vote on that basis.
Anything further from the board?
Motion to approve?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstained?
Abstain.
Abstained.
Three abstained. Steinhardt and Judge Garrett and Mr. Budnick. Anyone else? The rest were ayes, just to be sure we have the vote right? Okay, thank you very much.
Motion carries.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Hard work. I think we finally got a landing spot. It was complicated. And I'd like to actually, take a moment and really give my gratitude to the staff. This has been extremely complex. We have gone back and forth and found ourselves on the hot seat on this issue when the solutions weren't readily available to us that maybe philosophically we could have all lived with. But I think we've threaded the needle, and I think going forward we're in a very good place. With that said, moving on to, let's see, where are we? Strategic plan? Item E, strategic plan.
Good late morning, Madam Chair and members of the board. Thank you very much to the board as well for your participation on that. The many different times we went through that last agenda item is very important, obviously, and I appreciate all the discussion. I'm here today to request your approval of the VSCC strategic plan. Our planning process, as you'll recall, began back in February of this year. We had a workshop in which you developed 4 major goals. Those goals focus on decision-making, reducing recidivism, maximizing successful reentry, and data collection and reporting. You remember all the action steps. There's been a great deal of work done internally here at the VSCC. We presented a draft final plan to you back in September, had a good discussion, and you requested a few additional changes, which I'll just point to very briefly today. So we are asking for your final approval of the plan, and I'm going to start on the changes to the plan, and then I'm going to end the presentation with what our next steps will be. So turning to the slideshow. Pointed this one? Which one? Right here?
This one.
Okay. Ooh, wow, that's hard to read. Okay, so goal 1 is decision-making. The top line statement of the goal is make decisions fairly, inclusively, and transparently. There are 2 objectives. Of course, these materials are part of your attachments. 2 objectives to carry out the goal, and 3 strategies in each of those, in 3 strategies connected to objective number 1 and 4 connected to objective 2. At the September meeting, you did not make any further changes to that goal. Then we move on to goal 2. There we go. Which has to do with programs, training, and technical assistance. Your goal statement is support practices and policies shown to reduce recidivism and improve justice system outcomes for individuals and families. So in this goal, we have 3 objectives. The board did not make any further changes to this goal back in September. So moving then to goal 3, the title of this goal is Facilities and Alternatives to Incarceration. Your goal statement is maximize successful reentry and public safety by promoting the effective use of alternatives to incarceration and local corrections in adult and juvenile facilities. The change here was to make it really clear that both populations are covered, the juvenile and adult. In addition, within the 2 objectives on this goal, there were some fine-tuning amendments made back in September. The first objective focuses on training, technical assistance, and resources in support of effective programs and practices. The language of the goal was broadened, so it now includes mental health treatment and other effective programs and practices. The second objective centers on supporting healthy and safe custody environments and successful reentry. Per your direction, the term best practices was removed, again with the idea of providing a broader and more inclusive approach to that objective. And then finally, we have goal number 4, data collection and reporting. A couple of wording changes here, which you can see underlined there in the first objective. First of all, the goal statement is analyze and provide justice system data that inform effective policy and practice decisions. The 2 objectives are there, and the first one was modified to add data collection to our research planning efforts. You wanted that called out specifically. The second objective and strategies were not changed, and they are aligned around sharing broader data and research efforts as part of BSC's larger information clearinghouse responsibilities. So our hope as your staff is that you'll find that these 4 goals and their related objectives and strategy are reflective of where we are and, more importantly, where we want to be going. So I'll turn now to our process, and you'll remember this graphic from when we began in February and laid out the various steps that would be involved in the developmental process on a timeline. So we have now completed the development activities, and our focus is here on the section of the slide that is circled. These are going to be our implementation steps. We will be developing implementation groups to assist the board, well, rather the staff of the board, to develop plans and carry out the goals. I'd like to focus on goal number 1 as an example. We have an objective to improve our external communication. We will absolutely include external partners and stakeholders who are best positioned to help us understand communication gaps and how we can address them. And I'd like to just stay on this point for a brief moment to say it's really important that as the board that you have ownership over your strategic plan. And it's my job as your executive director, from the advice from our team, that we listen to the broad input from people who are interested, but then we make decisions and come back to you about what we can do within the restraints of our available resources in terms of staffing, time, funding, etc. So I always want to just bring that point of balance to say, of course, we're interested in listening. We're committed to listening about how we can do our jobs better, but then we have to do, I guess, what I would call the reality check, and I'll come back to you and say how that's looking, based on some good input from interested partners and stakeholders. Another example for an implementation team would be on the strategy to provide resources to support medical and mental health treatment. For that implementation group, we would want to invite in medical and mental health experts and also facility staff to give us direction about what they need, what kind of resources might be helpful, and how the BSCC can most helpful in making an impact there. I will report annually, at least, and more often if you would like, on our progress toward meeting the goals. We also do work in a very dynamic and sometimes quickly changing environment. So where there might be a need to make adjustments to the plan, I'd like to come before the board, have your permission to come back to say the strategic plan might need revision. And just keeping our priorities and our resources aligned with our current needs and meeting our strategic plan. So I'd like to see if you have any questions, and at this point, request approval of your revised strategic plan.
Anything from the board on this item? Nothing, which means Katie did an excellent job.
Yes, that is what it means.
Yes, and now to the public, any comments on the strategic plan? Seeing none, I look for a motion of the board to adopt our 3-year strategic plan.
So moved.
Second.
Comment?
Comment.
Not just on this presentation, but this is, there's such a dynamic going on in California in the justice system. And I gotta compliment the staff, just great reports, and you all know I'm a little ADD, but just the right information, but getting it out, and your flexibility in dealing with all the different sides of all these issues is just really impressive, and really, really good job today. So thanks for all your work to keep us on an interesting dynamic up here, all on the straight line and educated, so we can make the best decisions we can.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Agreed. Anybody else want to flatter the staff as they are?
Great job.
It's interesting.
We'll take tomorrow off.
Yeah, you know, it was a short, concise agenda, and when you think about the kind of work that goes on in the background, just preparing for this, and my compliments to everybody on all the hard work. Something as, dynamic as Colleen talking about, the cities that have high crime rates and explaining that to those of us here, so we understand it and we can move with it, are really meaningful. The regs were impressive. Council did a great job on responding to the questions about the regs. And so anyway, good meeting, and I appreciate everybody. Now we move from that item
I don't think they
to.
voted.
Oh, we didn't vote?
Yeah, they did.
No, they seconded.
They
We had a motion and a second, and then it got all nice.
And then you get a speech.
Let the record reflect.
Thanks, Tracy.
Let the record reflect that it was Sheriff Dean that hijacked this. So, all
Aye.
in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstained? Motion carries. Thank you for your help on that. And now, as we move towards the end of the agenda, this is the time for any public comment on any subject. And, I invite anybody from the public who would like to say anything as we close. Seeing none, I believe we can safely adjourn this meeting. Everybody's
Closed
safe.
session.
Closed session.
Not adjourned. Move to closed session. Then we come back to
Oh,
adjourn.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm not allowed to adjourn before we go to closed section. So now is the part where I kick everybody in the audience out.
Yes, we turn off the broadcast.
All the video. Yeah, you know, there's instructions everywhere.